Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right. You really outdid yourself this time.
Oh,
Yeah. The stack of books and articles on the U.S. and USSR after World War II.
I tried to find a good variety, get some different perspectives in the mix.
Pure historical gold.
Huh?
Our listeners are in for a treat. Get ready for a deep dive into how these two nations went from allies to rivals, sparking that decades-long standoff that, honestly, still feels relevant today.
It's fascinating, yeah. You picked up on it in your prep, how much these sources reveal about those early years after the war. It's like everyone thinks it was just about military strength, but it was way more than that. Economics, obviously, the clash of ideologies.
Right, like a whole powder keg of factors, and it just takes one spark.
And some would argue maybe more than one miscalculation along the way that really fueled the fire. But yeah, I think we should start with the obvious. Military positions. We know both the U.S. and USSR emerged from World War II as powerhouses, but man, their paths to that power, totally different stories, right?
Completely. So, what stood out to you about their military positions right after the war? Where do we even begin?
Well, you almost have to start with the Eastern Front. It's hard to even grasp the sheer scale of destruction and loss the USSR endured fighting the Nazis there. Just brutal. And their victories, I mean, you look at something like Stalingrad.
Oh man, talk about a turning point, but the cost.
Exactly. I mean, it solidified their strength, for sure, showed the world the Red Army was a force to be reckoned with. And of course, there's Stalin, right? Those victories in the East also solidified his grip on Eastern Europe.
Which, let's be real, wasn't just about pushing back the Nazis at that point.
Oh, absolutely not. This was about securing a buffer zone. I'm sure Stalin was thinking, never again, after the losses they suffered. He was shaping the geopolitical landscape, making damn sure Russia wouldn't be invaded like that again.
And that's something I think gets lost sometimes, the lasting trauma of those years, this determination to never be in that vulnerable position again.
Yeah.
You can kind of see how that mindset might lead to some forceful decisions. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, you have the U.S. emerging with, well, the atomic bomb.
Yeah, talk about a game changer. I mean,
a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen.
Absolutely. And whatever you want to say about the ethics of it, and believe me, there's a lot to unpack there, the atomic bombs ended the war in the Pacific, no question. And it catapulted the U.S. to a whole new level of global influence. It's not like they were a slouch before, but suddenly they were the nuclear power. They quickly established military bases all over the globe.
So you have these two titans, each wielding enormous military might, but forged in completely different fires.
Right, each with their own scars, their own anxieties about the future.
Which makes you wonder, was this clash of civilizations, was it inevitable? Was this rivalry baked into the cake from the beginning?
$1 million question, right. It's something historians have been going back and forth on for decades.
So walk us through it. Whose theories are we testing out here?
Well, there's a group you marked in your notes, the Orthodox historians, and they put the blame squarely on Stalin. Their argument is that his desire to expand Soviet influence, especially in Eastern Europe, installing communist regimes, you know the deal. That's what forced the U.S. into a defensive posture. And boom, the Cold War is on.
So, in their view, Stalin was the aggressor. Simple as that. He's pushing for control, and the U.S. had no choice but to react.
Essentially, yeah. But it's never that simple, is it? Because then you have the revisionist perspective, which you also highlighted in your reading, and they come in swinging a completely different way. They argue that the U.S., economically booming after the war, scared of another depression.
Which, let's be real, was a very real fear at the time.
Oh, totally. So the revisionists, they're saying the U.S. was way more interested in global economic domination, like the Marshall Plan, right? On the surface, a humanitarian effort rebuilding Europe after the war, all very noble. But under the surface...
the strategic power play.
Exactly. It's about rebuilding Western Europe in a way that benefits the U.S., aligns with their interests, and, crucially, prevents those war-torn countries from turning to communism.
Like the old saying, right? Follow the money. Were the battle lines drawn not just by ideology, but by who controlled the purse strings, the flow of global trade, who had access to what resources? Fascinating. But then there's that third group you mentioned, the realists, and they bring a whole different energy to this, don't they? What's their take on this superpower standoff?
The realists, they'd say, ideology, sure, that's part of it, but it's not the whole story, not even close. For them, you got to look at the big picture, the power dynamic.
The chessboard, right. Like who's making moves and who's reacting.
Exactly. You've got these two behemoths, the U.S. and the USSR, and World War II just ended. So there's this vacuum, right? And they both want to fill it exert their influence. It's classic power politics, like
Yeah.
almost inevitable, Two superpowers, they're going to bump heads.
So less about good versus evil, more like physics.
Yeah.
Two massive objects, just the sheer force of them colliding.
Kind of, yeah. But we can't forget, this wasn't some theoretical exercise, right? The clash between communism and capitalism, that had a real impact on people's lives. You can't just dismiss it as some intellectual debate.
No, absolutely not. People were living through this, making choices based on these systems.
Exactly. And the U.S., they're on top of the world at this point. Post-war economic boom, they're feeling good, and their message is all about democracy, free markets, the promise of prosperity. Look at us, they're saying. This is what freedom can get you.
And they weren't just talking to talk, were they? They put their money where their mouth was with the Marshall Plan.
Billions, man. Pumping money into rebuilding Western Europe. And sure, you could say it was the right thing to do, but
It was also strategic, right? We talked about this earlier.
100%. They were rebuilding those countries, but in a way that aligned with U.S. interests, keeping them out of the Soviet sphere of influence.
Which brings us to the USSR. Now, economically, they're in a rough shape after the war. But they're offering a different vision. Communism. The answer, they claimed, to the horrors of fascism.
And you can see how that message would resonate, especially in Eastern Europe. They had just gone through hell under Nazi occupation. So this idea of a more equitable society, no more exploitation, it was appealing to a lot of people.
Of course, we know it wasn't that simple. Often came at the cost of freedom, didn't it? Especially political freedom, individual expression.
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin. And it wasn't just rhetoric, right? This ideological battle was playing out on the ground. You had these flashpoints, these moments where it really came to a head.
Like those early conferences you mentioned earlier, Yalta, Potsdam. It seems like those were just tense.
Absolutely. You've got the wartime allies, the U.S., the U.K., the USSR. They're trying to hammer out the post-war order. But man, even in those early meetings, there's already so much mistrust brewing. You made a good point in your notes about Poland. It's like everyone wants to control their destiny, but nobody agrees on what that should look like.
Right. Ravaged by war, caught in the middle of this ideological tug of war, like trying to fit puzzle pieces together that just don't quite match. And then, of course, things escalate. You can't talk about this era without mentioning the Berlin Blockade. That must have felt like the Cold War heating up and fast.
Oh, absolutely a turning point. So Stalin, he wants the Western powers out of Berlin, right? So he does the unthinkable, completely blocks off land access to the city. Can you imagine? The tension, people trapped, families divided, a city holding its breath.
It's wild, right? The U.S. and its allies, they airlifted supplies into West Berlin for almost a year. A massive undertaking.
Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. That's commitment.
Right. Shows how far both sides were willing to go, even back then.
Yeah.
And that image, the Berlin Blockade, it really solidified this idea of a divided Europe. The Iron Curtain, like Churchill said.
Chilling, right. And it just keeps escalating. But honestly, I think the most chilling development, the one that really pushed the world to the brink, was the nuclear arms race.
Because the moment the USSR tested their own atomic bomb in '49, everything changes.
Game over. The stakes are just completely different.
It's not about territory anymore or political influence. It's about the potential for unimaginable destruction, mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
As terrifying as it is, that became the reality. What must it have been like to live under that kind of threat?
Honestly, I don't think we can even fathom it today, that constant fear, knowing that at any moment, it's heavy stuff. And the crazy part is a lot of this tension, it stemmed from mistrust and miscalculation, like genuine misunderstandings with the potential to end the world.
So you're saying that this wasn't all inevitable, that maybe, just maybe, things could have gone differently. That's where those post-revisionist historians you mentioned come in, right? Offering a different perspective, like trying to find the human element in all of this.
Exactly. They're like, hold on, let's not jump to conclusions here. They urge us to see both sides, the U.S. and the USSR, both operating from a place of fear.
Which, after the war, I mean, who could blame them?
Right. The whole world was reeling. So the post-revisionists, they're saying, yeah, both sides had their agendas, but a lot of those pivotal moments, those close calls, fueled by miscommunication, misinterpretations, this paralyzing fear of what the other guy might do.
It's chilling, you know?
Yeah.
To think that something as devastating as nuclear war could have been sparked not by evil masterminds, but by a series of misunderstandings. Human error makes it all the more real, you know? Those close calls, they weren't just plot points in a history book.
And it makes you think, right? about the importance of communication, of trying to understand the other side, even when, especially when you disagree with them, trying to see the world through their eyes. Those lessons, man, they matter today as much as they did back then.
No doubt. So as we resurface from this deep dive,
Yeah.
back into the sunlight and all, what are the big takeaways here? What should we leave our listeners with?
Well, first off, history is messy. It's not a straight line, not about good guys and bad guys. It's a tangled up mess of choices, accidents, big personalities, and yeah, sometimes flat out mistakes. The Cold War, it wasn't inevitable. It was a perfect storm.
Right, like all these factors colliding at just the wrong time.
Exactly. And second, power is a hell of a thing. Military, economic, whatever. It comes with responsibility. The potential for destruction back then, very real. The fear it generated, that shaped an entire generation.
Makes you appreciate those who were trying to navigate that landscape, right? Trying to find a path to peace with the threat of annihilation hanging over their heads. Leaders, diplomats, even everyday people just trying to live their lives. It wasn't just about ideologies or superpowers. It was about the fate of humanity.
Exactly. And that brings me to the last takeaway, I think. Something we touched on earlier. Understanding. Even when it's hard. When you look at the Cold War, at its core, it's this clash of ideologies. But it was made so much worse by this lack of empathy. You demonize the other side. You don't even try to understand where they're coming from. Well, we saw what that led to, and today. Man, we've got new challenges, global problems that require us to work together. Understanding different perspectives, that's not just a nice idea, it's essential.
It's like you said, history might not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So much to think about. You've given us a lot to unpack about this whole era. But if you had to leave our listeners with one question, one thing to chew on as they go about their day, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, let me think. How about this? How can we, knowing what we know about the Cold War, those dangers of miscalculation, the importance of diplomacy, how can we apply those lessons today to the challenges we're facing right now? That's something worth pondering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And on that note, folks, we're wrapping up our deep dive into the Cold War. Hopefully you're coming back up with a little more knowledge, a little more awareness of just how complex and fragile this whole thing is. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and stay curious.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.